Good afternoon, dear friends. Today we start a new cycle. Once we had a series of live broadcasts dedicated to the history of religion, and in the comments, many asked to return to this topic. So, we return. Let's start a course on the history of religions. Thank you, of course, as always, a huge thank you to our patrons on the Patreon platform and our sponsors on YouTube, without whom this lecture, and all the following ones, would not have been possible. If anyone else would like to support us, the link is below. Thank you very much. How did faith in God come about? The feeling that millions of people around the world are experiencing today, the feeling that gave birth to amazing sacred books, wonderful creations of art, and at the same time religious wars and the persecution of dissidents. It is impossible to imagine world history without the history of religions. This is the most important part of human life. From which moment? This is where things start to get really weird. But if we briefly outline the content of this lecture, then we can say this: when religion arose, we do not know. But don't worry, we won't stop there, because the more interesting it is to talk about it. We do not know for sure, but there are a huge number of different assumptions, different versions. Unfortunately, it is unlikely that we will ever be able to test them. Well, if only the time machine will arise. But each of these versions is interesting in itself. By the way, it says a lot about those people and about those eras when they arose. Well, it's always good when any of us can choose the option that seems more convincing to him. So let's go back in time to the old days. It's not clear which ones. Is it always the belief in supernatural forces, namely, it is the basis of any religion? Has the belief in supernatural forces always accompanied people? Well, probably. Almost every one of us, either at school or somewhere in some book, in a textbook, read such a wonderful explanation, dating back to Engels, that religion arose because of man's fear of nature. Primitive people were very afraid of everything, of course. What kind of lightning it was, they did not know. What it was electricity, what kind of thunder rumbles there, what kind of animals roam in the forest. And so they came up with the idea that there are many gods around. Very handy explanation. Especially for the time when people believed, prayed for progress, and from it they made practically a new god. Of course, primitive people, they are dumber than us, to put it simply. And so they did not understand anything and explained in such strange fantastic images. As one ethnographer wrote, it is very reasonable that this was invented by people who were not, say, with today's inhabitants of the jungles of Africa or the deserts of Australia, somewhere in this field, in their real habitat. Because modern man really does not understand anything. He may know what electricity is, but what kind of noise is there in the forest, and what is it cracked? Is it a branch or is it someone walking? What is there? Who is howling there? Nothing is incomprehensible to us. For us, this is an alien, terrible environment. For any native, and for us, in general, it is easy to assume that for any primitive person, although we will talk today whether it is possible to completely put an equal sign between them. But for any native, most of these sounds are completely understandable. This is the bird that sings, this is a tree, and he is there. The animals went to a watering place and so on. Wind means rain. That is, here is such a primitive explanation. Oh, they, the poor, did not know anything and therefore invented all sorts of gods. It still does not work, it is too simple. Of course, the ancient people were afraid of these supernatural forces, but just like at any time, any believer is afraid of the gods or God. But here the word afraid is bad, it is rude. This greatly simplifies the situation. It's just, naturally, that the ancient people believed that there were some very special forces in the world that stood above them, guiding their lives, which cannot be offended, which must be appeased, and so on. Fear is present, but it is not the only feeling. This is respect, and hope for them, and love for them, and the desire to ask them for something. There is a whole wide spectrum of different feelings. I doubt very much that it makes sense to associate everything with fear. Fear is an understandable idea that is being built. They knew nothing, they were afraid, and now we have learned all the laws of nature, and we are no longer afraid, so we overthrow all the gods from their pedestal. It is not that simple. Another question, also very, very difficult: has there always been a religion? Here, too, there are quite a few scientists who believe that there was once a non-religious period in ancient times. the most ancient people who were just transforming, developing, but not yet so much different from animals. These ancient people, they did not know religion. They did not know the worship of some higher beings. Here a problem arises, because we need to check this cannot. We can, in general, with the same level of certainty, say, no, they did not know any religion. Or yes, they knew, of course, religion, but, in general, how to prove this? Naturally, there are no sacred texts left, no rituals, nothing like that. What's left? There are archaeological finds left, which we will now talk about, from which some conclusions can be drawn. But there are at least two problems here. First, archaeological finds are what people have found. Or maybe there is something that is not found. Or rather, it cannot be, but surely there is something that has not yet been found or that has been destroyed in the process of human existence. Or some antiquities stored under today's modern cities. What's there? What could these finds tell us, which we may never find? Or all the same, I believe in the power of history. We will find it in 10 years, 100 years, more sometime. 200 years ago, people were just, 150 years ago, people were just beginning to imagine how primitive people lived. The first caves found with primitive paintings aroused outrage, and the unfortunate Sautuola, who discovered the cave of Altamira, was accused of being a swindler. He went to Paris, looked at the Impressionists, and hired an artist there himself, to paint something in his cave. That is, 150 years ago, people did not yet imagine that primitive people made some strange images in caves. Over the past 100-150 years, too, the entire time of the existence of mankind has sharply gone further and further into the past. Once upon a time it was assumed that humanity was created. That's how the biblical story says, no more than, there, existed for 7,000 years. Then the finds began to push it back. It turned out that ancient people existed already 20,000 years ago, 50,000, 100,000, a million. Today in Africa, on the territory, especially on the territory of Tanzania and Kenya, and in the very south of Africa, incredibly ancient remains of tools are found that indicate that people, those creatures, lived here, in Kenya on the coast of Lake Turkana, where amazing finds are being made, that they, it turns out, have already processed tools 2 million, 3 million? Now they seem to have found some kind of pebbles 4 million years ago. How far back in time will we go, and more importantly, how much do we know about them? Obviously not enough. And from those who wandered around Africa, there, 4-3-2.5 million years ago, there were finds. But, of course, not all. And so we can start from what we find, what archaeologists find, but we must always remember that our knowledge based on archaeology will always be incomplete. First thing. Second, a very convenient, found in almost any book about primitiveness, a very convenient way to learn something about primitive people is to draw parallels with today's, not a good word, primitive peoples, let's say, pre-state, people living in a pre-state way, tribal system. Of course, there are fewer and fewer of them left in the world. But, of course, there are in Africa, there are in the Amazon jungle, there are, of course, especially in Australia, there are people living in a very, very archaic way of life, who have preserved some absolutely ancient rituals, customs, myths, and so on, and so on. Similar. A question of questions, can we calmly put an equal sign between these people and those who lived in the past? But all these tribes today, they have some form of religion, they worship spirits, they have rituals, they have shamans, and so on and so forth. Can we say that it means that those who lived, let's not get ahead of 4 million, 2 million years ago or a million years ago, also had such rights? The problem is that the inhabitants of the Amazon or the Australian Aborigines, they are the same people as we are, there is no doubt about it. This is also Homo sapiens. They live differently, they naturally have a completely different way of life, but they are the same people. That is, if a child from some of this, so to speak, a primitive tribe is transferred from the moment of birth to a big city and raised accordingly, he will grow up exactly the same as the rest of the townspeople. But those who lived 1 million or 2 million years ago were not yet Homo sapiens, they were different. These were very different, diverse branches of the development of primitive people. Their brains were not yet so developed, they still did not immediately have speech. Did they have a religion or not? They left virtually no trace of her. And what is found in the ground? Tools, parking lots, bones, the remains of some kind of life activity in a cave, or at the entrance to a cave. A lot of conclusions can be drawn from this. But this also has its own specifics, because any find can be interpreted in different ways. It does not say, this is such and such a tool, it was made then. All this is calculated. And here there is a lot of room for different interpretations. Therefore, of course, the origins of religion are lost somewhere in the depths of millennia. But what can be said in favor of this idea that religion has not always existed? The fact that indeed at the most ancient stages of human development we do not see any traces of faith in higher powers, in the afterlife, or any kind of cult, all the more so. But we will never be able to say for sure that this was not the case. Perhaps the worship of the gods consisted in some dances and chants that have not reached us. We do not know. There remains a big, big question mark. Since when do we know anything? In Spain, there is the cave of Atapuerca, which was inhabited for a long time, but, obviously, already somewhere 600,000 years ago it was inhabited. And a very large number of human bones were found in this cave, which makes it possible for some scientists to say that, probably, these bones appeared here for a reason. Obviously, the people who lived here folded at least somehow. That is, they somehow buried their dead. But this is one of the main signs of the existence of religion. Almost any religion speaks of the existence of the afterlife. If the afterlife exists, it means that a person goes there, he needs to somehow facilitate this transition, perform rituals, put some things with him or, for example, just put him in the ground, so that it would be easier for him to this underworld leave. Now, if these bones are numerous in Atapuerca, if these are really burials, then it can be assumed that some idea of the afterlife already existed. But there are two objections to this. First, there are scientists who believe that these are not burials, that it's just that, perhaps, streams of water and some displacements of the earth brought these bones, and thus, this is not a conversation at all. Another question is also, if people were simply piled up here and, say, there, even sprinkled with earth, does this necessarily indicate belief in the afterlife? Maybe, just like that, in modern terms, these were some kinds of hygienic, sanitary, or rather even sanitary actions. It is clear that the people of that time did not imagine the harmful power of microbes and so on, but they knew a lot purely by experience. And, obviously, the decomposing bodies of the dead did not bring much pleasure. Accordingly, maybe they were simply folded somewhere, removed so that they would not interfere. Maybe so. I really hope that some other discoveries will help us clarify this. Let's get a little closer to us. Somewhere between 100,000 years ago and 60,000, of course, not millions, but still a very long time ago, in the Plumbos Cave, the flowering forest, primitive people also lived in South Africa. And here you can see that they made ochre. With ochre, everything is very interesting, because it is a natural paint obtained from mineral substances, which was used a lot. We know this from later times, a lot was used in various ceremonies and, in particular, burials. A lot of different burials were found in different places of the world, where a person was laid in the ground and sprinkled with ochre. At the same time, the most common ochre in the world, in nature, of course, it is of different yellowish shades. Sometimes red ochre is natural, but still, in most cases, in order to get red ochre, you need to burn yellow, and then a chemical reaction takes place there, and the ochre becomes red. So most of these burials are with red ochre. That is, for some reason people made efforts, burned ochre, received such a red powder, poured it into burial places. But there is a version that it was, as it were, a symbolic image of blood, what suggests itself, here it is red in red blood. And this means that it is, as it were, a pledge of the future resurrection. It sounds nice, but, again, we are unlikely to ever be able to prove it. But one thing is clear, that these people who were lying in the graves, covered with ochre, they were definitely not left just like that, to fall asleep, so that, roughly speaking, they would not stink there, but some rituals were performed here. And this already says a lot. There was a whole workshop in the Plumbos Cave. Ochre was made there. So they needed her for some reason. Another thing found in the same place, beads were found there. Well, in general, we can say that these are beads. These are shells of one of these mollusks, like a snail, which, of course, have holes in them and some kind of engraving. But we can say that it could just be beads. Of course, decorations. On the other hand, after all, this is what we know from the customs of modern peoples and, by the way, not only primitive ones. Any, so to speak, folk decorations, embroideries, some kind of belts, that's what today is called accessories, all this had a certain magical meaning. Even in ancient Russia, until the 19th century, this was realized. Today we don't look at it very much and don't understand why, say, the hem was decorated with embroidery, why the sleeves were fastened and also decorated with embroidery, why they put on a belt. This, of course, all were magical. Yes, the collar, of course, all these were magical actions that did not allow some harmful spirits to penetrate the human body. Just like today, dishes are very different, but until recently, almost any plate had a rim and some kind of drawings. Of course, we never thought about it. Today there are already plates very often without it. In my childhood, let's say, there were no plates without rims. And this is also a response to ancient ideas. Any pots are also the most ancient in which food was cooked. They are covered with some kind of ornament. And this is understandable, they cook food here, and then what do? And then this food is transferred to the mouth. That is, you put something from this pot to yourself. And if there are evil spirits, then he will thus get to you. Therefore, this pattern on an ancient primitive pot or a rim on today's plate, it seems to protect what gets into a person. But not so long ago, until today, it is not customary to yawn frankly. Yes, you need to cover your mouth. She said yawn, and immediately wanted to yawn. You have to cover your mouth when you yawn. Not so long ago, it was assumed that you need to cross your mouth when you yawn. Why? And so that the devils do not fall. But it is also clear that this is some kind of representation that existed long before Christianity. Here he opened his mouth, and again, some malicious creatures will get there. And the beads made somewhere between 160,000 years ago, which are clearly some kind of jewelry with some kind of applied images. Most likely, of course, it was not done just like that. It had some magical meaning. While I used the word magic, it turns out that I more or less somehow put an equal sign between magic and religion. This, of course, is wrong, but in any case, let's say that it had to do with some kind of supernatural forces. Maybe protection from them. Maybe, on the contrary, as a call for help. But in any case, this tradition is also, it is clear that it exists everywhere, wearing talismans, some kind of incense, crosses, magic signs. All this also goes somewhere there, in this South African cave. We move on. In the same South Africa, in the Diepkloof cave, fragments of multicolored ostrich eggs with engravings were found. Obviously, these eggs were used. I see, ostrich eggs are big. Obviously, they were used to carry some, maybe liquids. Again, our imagination can immediately begin to boil and produce a variety of versions. Maybe just to carry water, maybe to store water. Or maybe to perform some rituals. Or maybe these engravings. Do you know what efforts should be? Let's imagine a primitive man. His hand is still poorly developed, and his brain is not yet as developed as ours. In order to put some images on the shell of ostrich eggs, what subtlety of work is needed, what efforts are needed? Just like that, there is also an idea. Well, it was just a desire for beauty, always inherent in people. And now, imagine sitting in a cave. He has stone tools there, hunting. And here he needs to admire the beauty, and for this they take. So, you need to find these ostrich eggs and paint and scratch them. Some rather strange notion of aesthetic feeling. I mean, it must have been there. But still it somehow seems more logical, although the question is, does our logic always work in relation to the ancients? It seems more logical that it was for some sacred things. But what it was, really ceremonies in honor of the gods, or simply so that the water is better preserved here, and the spirits helped, we do not know. We can only guess. So, it turns out that even before a person became Homo sapiens, the same as we are, maybe he already had some ideas about higher powers. And not just, oh, how terrible the thunder rumbles, but these were ideas that these forces require, well, let's say, some images or, maybe, some rites and so on. For a long time it was assumed that a truly religious feeling could only arise in Homo sapiens. He has a sufficiently developed brain, he has art. There is already a completely different level of human development, but before that it is still not the same. In recent years, probably even decades, there has been such a kind of rehabilitation of Neanderthals, who for a very long time were considered our distant relatives. Much worse developed than Homo sapiens, with a worse developed brain. They could not speak, they could not do anything at all. And when Homo sapiens came to Europe, they gradually either simply killed them all, or drove them into some kind of northern forests, where they died out, poor fellows. Maybe there is some reason for this. Well, first of all, today, as we know from DNA, that, let's say, all of us have Neanderthal genes. That is, there was some kind of mixing of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. Secondly, a lot of finds have shown that our, so to speak, great-aunts and grandfathers were not so bad. Yes, the brain is still underdeveloped, but, let's say, that part of the brain that is responsible for speech has already been developed. And speech is, of course, a very important point. Another thing, they began to find finds of Neanderthals, which allow us to say that they had already buried their dead. But if there is a burial, this, as I just said, is a very important sign. Another very significant thing, like everything in our conversation today, causing numerous disputes, Neanderthals clearly hunted cave bears. There were a lot of cave bears throughout Europe and Eurasia. They were huge, reaching, when standing on their hind legs, 3 meters. Today's bear too. I don't really want to meet him on a narrow path. This is not a clumsy bear from a song, but what a terrible predator. Imagine 3 meters. But it looks like it killed them. That they were still powerful, scary, huge, but not mobile enough. And, accordingly, they lost even to other predators. Well, like many such representatives of megafauna. And people too. And the Neanderthals hunted them a lot. Well, they hunted, well done, but at the same time, for example, in Switzerland there is a cave with a very characteristic name Drakenloch, that is, a cave, a pit of a dragon. But it is clear that the people of subsequent centuries, who lived here in Switzerland, obviously had some idea that something was wrong in this cave. There were some terrible creatures. And, therefore, at some point there was an idea that dragons lived there. No traces of dragons were found there, but a huge number of bear skulls were found there. We do not know exactly how many of them there are even now, and how many there were. This cave was found at the beginning of the 20th century. She was pretty badly hurt. It was not dug up very well at first. It is not entirely clear how it all started there. In any case, about 1,000 skulls were found, and there is an assumption that there may be tens of thousands more. At the same time, these skulls were very neatly laid out in a cave. That is, the version that it was just some kind of place where the bears came to die, roughly speaking, it was put forward, but it does not work very well. They are very neatly there. There was another version that, perhaps, somewhere there were, let's say, primitive people were hunting, butchering, maybe here, for example, the carcasses of bears and then taking away the meat. Yes, that's good too, but no one has yet answered the question why out of these hundreds of bear heads, only one has a lower jaw left, and the rest are all these heads, skulls without a lower jaw. Moreover, there are other places in Europe where the skulls of cave bears were also found, and also without a lower jaw. This is far, but if we assume that it was just cutting food, then the lower jaw, where did they put it on? It's far from the tastiest piece. Why was she removed? What's happened? There is a find in the same Switzerland, where there is a burial of a Neanderthal, and next to it is a burial of a bear's head. It is an accident? Maybe, maybe not. And if you imagine what a huge, incredible number of fairy tales, myths, legends, rituals are associated with bears throughout Eurasia, from Britain to Siberia at various times, this probably speaks of some very deep cult of the bear. But one of the explanations, not the only one far away, but it is from the explanations of the name of the legendary King Arthur, is that his name means bear. And maybe once it was some kind of magical creature that was worshipped in the form of a bear. We all know a huge number of fairy tales, in which in most of them the bear acts as such a fool, who ate from my bowl? Masha carries. I sit high, I look far away. That is, he is some kind of person who is always somehow cheated by heroes. But here, too, a very clear pattern is visible. The hero, the heroine very often goes into the forest. The forest is a magical place. Someday we'll talk about it separately. There was a request here to make a lecture on fairy tales, and we will definitely fulfill it. The forest is a magical place. There the heroine gets to the bear, there she performs some actions, as a result of which he returns home or receives a groom, or receives wealth. In general, he receives some kind of award. That is, a bear in the forest is clearly such a magical place, its abode. A famous linguistic example, what is obvious, in the Slavic languages, even, say, in Old Russian and in others, there was no word bear so familiar to us. And there was some other word, obviously, the same root with such an Indo-European root as the English bear or the German bear and so on. Something like that. And this root remained. Where does the bear live? The bear lives in a den. This is the lair, here is the log. Swiss hole, pit, where does bear live? Well, there are assumptions quite shared today by most scientists, that, obviously, there was some other name for this terrible animal, but they did not dare to call it by that name. He was too sacred, terrible. As today, hunters still believe that it is impossible to name a bear in the taiga. Therefore, there are a huge number of words that replace him, grandfather, old man, master of the taiga, and so on. And they didn't call bear, but they said, the owner of the forest, the one who knows honey. Honey, days, this is how the bear appeared. Obviously, his first name was surrounded by such sacred horror that it was simply forgotten gradually. The stories are amazing. As early as the 19th century, amazing stories about bears were recorded in Siberia, which, of course, is somewhere far away in the forest. The main bear, the owner of all the other bears, and at the same time all the other animals. In the 19th century, among one of the Siberian peoples, ethnographers described the following custom. That if a bear was killed on a hunt, and this is always a very important matter for the whole tribe, this is how much meat, but at the same time they attacked such a great, powerful, terrible. They brought him to the village, they started. My students are always very happy when I tell this. They began to cut the skin and said, "Hello, grandfather. Thank you for coming to visit us. Let's take off your fur coat, come in." That is, they act out such a performance or ceremony that it would be like he came to visit them. Then they take off all the meat, carefully fold the bones. Also, by the way, beliefs that are found everywhere, from Siberia to ancient Greece, if all the bones are folded, the skin is sewn up, then this creature will come to life. They folded, sewed up, made in the center of the village something like a tribune, a stage. They put this grandfather there, who was visiting them, arranged a holiday in his honor, killed several dogs, which, as it were, also passed into this magical world in this way. And it was supposed that after that, the spirit of this bear, together with the spirits of these dogs, would run into the forest and the main bear, and tell everyone else, "Guys, it's so great there. Well, the hunt will continue to be good." These are 19th century performances. Are they somehow connected with these ancient Neanderthal burials? I'd like to think so, yes. Of course, again, we will never prove this. But the ethnographic material showing this gigantic bear worship is enormous. You can talk about this endlessly. And the finds are very, very ancient. I emphasize once again, even before Homo sapiens, they allow us to assume something of this kind. Well, and if we are already moving closer to us, sometimes it is believed that there is one find, which, as it were, already speaks for sure about the existence of religion. That's all that was before that. These are assumptions, these are such not entirely clear versions. And then there is the lion man. So the lion man. In fact, the Russian language simply does not allow to say so, because in Western languages it is. Here in English they call it lionman. That is, on the contrary, a lion man, but it does not matter. This is a figurine made of mammoth tusk, which was found in Germany in 1939, just a few days before the start of the Second World War. Therefore, accordingly, it was broken into more than 200 pieces. and its size is only about 30 centimeters. Accordingly, no one had the time or desire to study it. And she lay there for a long time in a museum in the city of Ulm next to the cave where they found her. And only after the war the time came when they paid attention to it. She was restored. Well, here, too, you can immediately say that it was first restored in one way, then in a different way. As a result of the second restoration, it grew by 5 millimeters, that is, all these fragments were glued together a little differently. But in any case, this is a figurine that depicts a man with a lion's head. There is such a feminist trend that proves that in fact this is a woman with the head of a lioness. But still, the gender of this creature is not entirely clear, but, well, it seemed to be said. One of the proofs was that there was no mane. What is this lion? But they say that the cave lions had such a small mane that they could not depict it. In any case, this is some, let's say, a man-beast. And this first one is no longer. These are not some fragments on which something is depicted, but this is clearly a statuette depicting some kind of supernatural being. A few years ago there was a very interesting exhibition in the British Museum. Well, there are no uninteresting ones. There was a very interesting exhibition on the history of religion. And here is the first exhibit. Right at the entrance there is still nothing, highlighted by some kind of bills in an empty space. This man-lion stood. Such an amazing start, the starting point. And indeed, many count from this, but it is also clear that this is not a man, and it is clear that this is not a lion. That is, it is some kind of magical creature. What does it mean? What are its functions? There are already a huge number of different interpretations here. We will return to this in a while. But, in any case, this is such a starting point. And it was made, there are already different dates, but between 37,000 and 40,000 years ago. That is, it is already Homo sapiens, it is already closer to us. Somewhere around the same time, there are also different dates. Somewhere in the region of 35-30,000 years ago, at the other end of Europe, near the city of Vladimir, under a place called Sungir, which has become, is now such a generally famous place of ancient archaeology. A lot of interesting things were found there. There was a parking lot of ancient people, but in particular, 2 teenagers were found. It is considered there, one is somewhere around 9-10, the other may be December 13, 2014, they say differently. Adolescence. For a long time it was always considered that it was a boy and a girl. Today they did a DNA test. Oh, it turned out that these are 2 boys. Well, anyway, here are these 2 children, who lie with their heads to each other. Like this. Quite an unusual form of burial. At the same time, they were covered with an incredible amount of mammoth tusk beads. There is also an adult buried there. Thousands of beads are calculated. Again, this means that these primitive hunters and gatherers, they were sitting. There is a suggestion that maybe one of these teenagers did this, because he has one hand. So the joints look like he all the time doing some kind of rotational movements. So they sat and drilled through these tiny beads, which took a huge amount of time. We don't know how many people have done it, but it's a huge effort. By the way, they are covered with ocher, that's another effort. That is, it is not just that. In the stomach of one of these boys, the remains of only vegetable food. It is clear that he ate only plant foods for at least several months before his death. This is also very strange, because he lives in a tribe of hunters. Has hunting been this bad for a while? He doesn't look exhausted. At least his skeleton does not speak of some kind of terrible starvation. But on the other hand, we know that in different civilizations, up to ancient Greece, plant food was given, for example, to the one who was supposed to make a sacrifice. Maybe here, on the contrary, they gave to the one who was sacrificed. They are lying. There are some seemingly understandable things with them, like copies, for some reason some kind of tibia. And there are various interpretations here. There is an interpretation that this is the bone of some of their ancestor, and there is an interpretation that this is a bone that was used there to make fabrics. So we can't be sure of anything. There is also a bone horse placed in this burial. What is this? A toy that these kids played with? If we remember, again, with what a huge number of myths at a later time the image of a horse is associated, which was generally considered by a huge number of peoples to be a sacred creature, a solar creature. The gods ride, a variety of gods, there, some kind of Helios or many others. On a chariot, many gods ride across the sky. A horse in an old Russian hut is also no coincidence that it is on the roof. Well, today a horse is not necessarily an image of a horse. But it is very characteristic that the top of the roof is called a ridge. That is, this is a horse that is directed there to heaven. There are, again, a million examples when a horse was sacrificed, sent to the afterlife with its owner. It is probably no coincidence that this horse appeared there. It is even more interesting that there are some strange discs with slots, about which one can say anything at all, that these are wheels from some kind of chariot. Everything is wonderful, only they did not yet know any chariots. That this is an image of the sun, that this is an image of some kind of circle of life, that this is just a magical object that should facilitate the transition to another world. This is an amazing find in some gear, which has been interpreted in different ways and will continue to be interpreted, will be explained in different ways, but it certainly says one thing: we do not know how these children died. That is, obviously, they were sacrificed. Why? For what reason? For what? Usually children, of course, were sacrificed in some kind of emergency. We do not know with what rites this was connected. We do not know what gods or spirits it was dedicated to. But the fact that this is clearly a rite, that they first ate some special food, obviously completely special clothes were made for them, sprinkled with ocher, some strange things were put in this grave. This all suggests that there is some kind of belief system here. It remains only to find out which one. Since the second half of the 19th century, ethnographers have studied a lot, but they continue to study those peoples who were outside the boundaries of European, North American civilization. It is clear that European civilization spread, seized colonies. Europeans came to different places where only some of the most heroic travelers used to be, and learned a lot. Almost, probably, at the same time. No, probably, after all, let's say this. It all started with the North American Indians, with whom, as we know, they did not do very well, but at the same time there were many scientists who studied Indian tribes, described their customs, recorded, sketched, and therefore we know quite a lot about the life of the Indians when they first came into contact with the American colonists. Studied African tribes. The study of the Australian tribes, which may be one of the most archaic on Earth, has given an incredible amount. And if at first it was just a description, then, based on all these facts, scientists began to build their own versions. It was here that what I already spoke about began, when they began to draw parallels between these peoples in primitive times. Once again I will say that it is very difficult, it is dangerous. We must always understand that there can never be 100% coincidence. Well, this is, in any case, something, it gives some material for reasoning. But at the same time, again, as always happens, this material gave rise to the most different, most unexpected versions. In the 19th century, in 1871, the English ethnographer Edward Tyler published his classic book called Primitive Culture, where he collected a huge amount of material. In the original, this is called Primitive Culture. More about different peoples, primitive peoples, which in fact are not primitive at all, but with very complex systems, rules, ideas. But Tyler defended the idea that culture is just culture in its basic fundamental principles, that it does not change. It is clear that the ways of painting a picture are changing, but the idea of the world, the idea of the gods, the idea of a person, they remain approximately the same. Initially, they are the same, and then living conditions can already influence them. And therefore, with very great interest, both in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, both books by Tyler and another great ethnographer, John Fraser, were read. They greatly influenced not only history, ethnography, but also poetry, literature, in general, the view of man. So they kind of discovered some things in a person. What did they discover? Tyler formulated this phrase: animism is the minimum of religion. That is, religions can develop further, create complex schemes, and so on, but the beginning, the foundation is animism. What does it mean? This is the spiritualization of everything: trees, animals, nature. Here the whole world is full of some kind of spiritual principle, animated, and primitive people feel this very keenly. They consider not only they're animals, say, not just alive, but their relatives. They consider trees to be alive. Further, another concept, very fashionable in relation to the primitive world, will grow out of this, as fetishism, that is, the animation of inanimate nature. Not only animals have a soul, not only. Well, okay, there's a plant, a stone can have a soul. It was noted among various peoples that any object, somehow slightly different from the usual, yeah, it's probably not easy, there is something magical in it. Here Tyler gives an example of how a certain person from one African tribe was walking and stumbled on a stone. He immediately realized that this stone is not easy. He took it, brought it, began to worship him. This means that he can be anointed or, there, dressed up, or you can beat him if he does not fulfill your request. That is, it is a kind of living being with which you can interact. Another thing that was also discovered at that time, invented, I don't even know how to put it better, formulated and which is incredibly popular to this day is the idea of totemism as the oldest, one of the archaic forms of religion. But the word totem came just from the North American Indians, in whom it meant the magical ancestor animal. We all saw some Indian films, read books where there is the vigilant falcon, Chingachgook the big serpent and so on. What does it mean? That there is a tribe that everything comes from a falcon, there is a tribe that comes from a snake, from a wolf, from a bear, and the like. And every tribe. Then there's the word totem, today it is used all over the world. The tribe considers itself descended from a bear or from a seal, or, there, from whatever. And here there are two options. One option is that then this animal is taboo for this tribe, that is, you can't kill your ancestor, and they don't hunt him, they don't eat him, they don't touch him. Sometimes there is another option, that, on the contrary, they just hunt for him. But in any case, they feel a kinship with this creature, and they depict their spirits, the patrons of the tribe. Today, a huge number of different wonderful totem poles have been collected. In particular, American Indians, which depict some strange birds, whales, bears of the same and so on, as ancestors. All these representations are superimposed very well, say, on the image of this very lion man found in Germany, or on another image that causes great controversy, in a cave in the south of France. There are a lot of primitive caves in the south of France and in the north of Spain. Here is the famous Cave of Three Brothers in the south of France, where images were found that are considered to be the image of a primitive priest. There is a certain creature that seems to be standing on its feet. That is, it is like a man, but at the same time he has a lot of some kind of animal features. He has horns. And whether it's like a lion man, part animal. Sometimes it is believed that this priest, a shaman in a mask depicting an animal, which is also full of ethnographic material, when shamans put on some kinds of masks. Well, here, however, there are big problems with this image, because now there's a version that the archaeologists who dug it up painted it pretty much. Or they interpreted it the way they thought, therefore, there will also be a lot more to think about it. But in any case, these ideas that ancient people felt their kinship with animals, plants, nature, their closeness to them, they are indeed very strongly confirmed by ethnography. A surge of tremendous interest in these ideas appeared after the release of a large, very heavily overloaded, of course, with materials huge study by the English ethnographer George Fraser, which is called The Golden Bough. Today, of course, ethnographers and historians consider this book quite outdated. And yet it is hard to read it, because there are a huge number of different rituals and customs that exist everywhere. And then you just get the feeling that he just dumped together a huge amount of everything. But The Golden Bough had an incredible impact on world culture at the beginning of the 20th century. Everyone read it. And, for example, completely unexpected things, for example, Thomas Stearns Eliot, the great English poet, was very much influenced by Fraser, and many others, because he discovered some things about culture. What did he come up with? And he wrote a lot about magic. I said that I used the word magic almost as a synonym for the word religious, which is probably not entirely true. But still, Fraser believed that magic is some kind of the first early very stage in the development of religion, which then, again, is preserved and present in everything. And in fact, if you think about it, we will see that magic, indeed, some ideas have come down even to this day. Magic is a representation of the interconnection of everything in the world. That, roughly speaking, like can be influenced by like. Here such, means, primitive homeopathy. But unlike homeopathy, as a pseudoscience, magic did not pretend to be a science at all, but pretended to be. Although yes, it replaced science to some extent, of course. Explain any existing relationships. The simplest example, there is an Australian myth about how the sun appeared, because there some magical creature grabbed an egg, threw it into the sky, the egg broke, and that's how the sun appeared. Absolutely understandable. If we imagine a broken yolk with a squirrel around, this is the most perfect sun. They are similar, so that's how it arose. A very popular bird in Australia is the kookaburra, which also operates in many myths, and in particular, there is a myth that says that the sun rises because the kookaburra screams. And this call of her magically causes the sunrise. That is, it is not a bird that screams because the sun is rising, but it screamed, like, say, among the Slavic, and not only, say, among European peoples, the cry of a rooster. The rooster crows at dawn, he already feels the approach of light. No, the sun is rising because the rooster is crowing. It's the magic spell that summons it. That is, there are some interrelations, and these interrelations can be somehow influenced. Well, also the most famous example, for example, in the Louvre there is an ancient Egyptian small figurine of a certain woman. We can assume that this is some kind of rival, something of that kind, which another woman, probably, pierced with needles in different places. And naturally, obviously, at the same time she casts spells, wishing her rival to die. Until now, there are people who pierce a photo with a knife and think, someone is just from evil, and someone thinks that this will harm the one who is depicted on it. Hair, a piece of nail. Why it was impossible. Until now, there are traditional cultures where you need to cut your nails, you need to hide them. Even no one can understand why. And this is that piece of you that can get to someone, and now you can put it in such a wax figure and conjure it. To conjure with your piece, and it will bring you some harm. So Fraser saw magic, these magical connections, as the fundamental, most important moment in all primitive religion. Well, again, really ethnographic materials show this very strongly. About how in various tribes there's a belief in this dependence, witchcraft, everything is based on magic. Yes, and on the fact that like can either be cured by like or be harmed. In general, this, again, is connected with these Tyler ideas that everything is interconnected in the view of primitive man. This is not the world, this is some kind of living organism, it is part of it and, accordingly, it can come into contact with different parts of this organism, with other people or with animals, or with trees, or with a stone, or the sun, or with the surrounding spirits, because they don't go anywhere either. Who are these spirits? On the one hand, these are the spirits of the ancestors, these are those who, with the appropriate rites, were put into the ground, and they did not go far. We recently talked about this before the new year. About how already in later times there are special holidays in the calendar, when these ancestral spirits come, when they need to be appeased, fed, respected. You can ask them about the future and with their help conjure a good future for yourself. This, of course, also comes from ancient times. There are some hostile, malicious spirits. Painful, deadly. You need to protect your clothes from them with embroidery or some kind of amulets. You need to protect your food, you need to protect your home, your village in a variety of ways. Here a house, a hut or, there, a village hut is being built. A house is built in compliance with certain rituals, and it becomes such a protective shell. Here is the threshold. Why is the threshold of the house always such a difficult place? Why is it impossible to pass things through the threshold? There are spirits there. Why can't you look out the window after the sun has set? Because that's where these spirits come out. And, God forbid, you will also let them in. It all exists to this day. The notion that a vampire cannot enter a house unless he is called there. Why? The house is a protection, it is a shell. But when Gogol's coma brute draws a magical circle around himself, this is completely illogical. He is in church, he reads prayers. But prayers do not protect him. That is, prayers too, but this magic circle protects him, which came from some also unprecedented depths of antiquity. I must say that, of course, these ideas of both Tyler and Fraser, on the one hand, really had a gigantic impact on the culture of the 20th century. Today ethnographers already consider them somewhat outdated. And there are many different other ideas about how religion arose. And, probably, a very important difference appeared after the works of the famous French ethnographer Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, who abandoned this view that people have always been the same. In ancient times, they believed in some kind of magical connection, and even today they believe a photo of a rival is punched or, there, some kind of magical amulet is worn. Lévy-Bruhl came to the conclusion that the most ancient beliefs. Today, Lévy-Bruhl has also been thrown from the ship of our time. I really like this idea. The development of mankind is, as it were, similar to the development of a single person. How does the little man imagine the world? He doesn't understand it yet. He sees some kind of force that exists around him. Yes, they are usually blessed. They give him milk, food, warmth. They appear here all the time. They shift it, lift it, change clothes. That is, he is completely in their power. To some extent, one might say, he deifies them. Then, as we know, around the age of 3, children become very harmful and at the same time why? That is, they somehow or separate themselves from these great deities and begin to make their own way in life. Here Lévy-Bruhl believed that the representations of primitive savages were as prological as he said. That is, still infancy. That our logical chains, which we always build, did not work there. It's raining. If I walk in the rain, I'll get wet. So I need to take an umbrella with me. It is raining, the primitive man says, which means that, in ancient Rus, they would say that Piran opens the earth with the help of rain, and goblin, mermaids and snakes come out from there. Not very logical. But there are some kinds of interconnections that are completely different from ours. But in any case, no matter how one explains this first idea of people, I have no doubt that there will still be a huge number of different theories, different versions about this. But it is quite clear that people really lived surrounded by this kind of supernatural world, surrounded by spirits, both good and evil. It is quite clear that there were people who, it was believed, knew how to handle them better than others. Evil sorcerers. Well, let's say, among a huge number of African tribes, it was believed that if a person dies unexpectedly, then only from witchcraft. This is recorded by many different. The same Lévy-Bruhl wrote down others. Did a tree fall on him? Yes. Why did he die? He was bewitched. So the tree fell on him. Because he was bewitched. Did this one drown? Yes. I don't know, the crocodile ate him because he was bewitched. And you can destroy witchcraft only by killing the sorcerer. There is no other option. And on the other hand, there are people who can direct these supernatural forces to the benefit of everyone. These are shamans. Of course, not everyone can be a shaman. Now I will say such a funny thing. The way one becomes a shaman is described in Pushkin's poem The Prophet. A huge number of Siberian, Mongolian, various shamans are recorded there, who tell how the spirits demanded that he become a shaman. They took him somewhere to another world. They killed him. This is how the corpse lay in the desert. They killed him, and then they returned him to his body, and he became a completely different person. And now he can also leave his body, be transferred to the world of spirits and heal the sick there, or predict something else. In my beloved Mongolia, there is a museum, a huge open-air museum in the steppe, which tells about the life of nomads of the 12th century. And this museum is interesting because people really live there. In Mongolia, this did not require any big dressing up and no stress at all. There, let's say, you drive a lot of hectares across the steppe, and here is a settlement of pastoralists. They're really people live, graze cattle. Only tourists come and look at them. And there is a settlement of a shaman, and a shaman really lives there. First time. I've been there several times. For the first time, when we were brought here, and there are yurts like this in such a semicircle. And in these yurts the masks of different Mongolian clans are kept. Absolutely incredible beauty. One of these masks looked very much like Master Yoda, just the spitting image of Master Yoda. Maybe Lucas, of course, also saw such masks. Or maybe Master Yoda is really a great shaman. They brought us there and said, "Come out, look at all these yurts, masks. But just don't go into that one, there the shaman treats the girl, What is happening there? The girl fell ill, they brought her, so he performs the ceremony there. Well, okay, fine. The next time in a few years I was there again. We were told we could talk to the shaman. He lives in a tent right there. A guy in his 30s, say, in sweatpants, sneakers. I say, how did you become a shaman? Have you been a shaman for a long time? About 10 years. And then it's very interesting. I say to him, what did you do before you became a shaman? But I don't remember. Well, he probably lied. This is the answer everyone expects from him, that he has forgotten his previous life altogether. But who knows? I don't know. It is assumed that the shaman is completely transformed, and he can now. I don't know if the shaman cured a girl who was treated there in this yurt, but it's completely clear that if she believed that he could cure her, then, unless, of course, it was not appendicitis, then, of course, there are chances for recovery. Because all these magical connections work when people believe in them, of course. But not all, many. Otherwise, I now look like a completely strange person. So, summing up, what do we know about the ancient religion? We know a lot of images. We know the primitive paintings in the caves, which were explained for a very long time, just like the places where primitive magic was created. That is, let's say, he drew a bison, danced a dance, pierced a bison with a spear and went hunting tomorrow, and caught a real bison. Today, this magical interpretation is already being abandoned. Today we have studied beautiful ideas that in fact all these caves with primitive paintings are places where primitive people believed that they come into contact with spirits. Maybe they intoxicated themselves with some kind of narcotic or alcoholic substances. They fell into this darkness, which only the light of the torch separated. And one historian writes wonderfully, and you can imagine it right now, that it means that a man comes, and yet these caves are very far hidden. It's not like any primitive man could come and do magic. That's where he gets there. There, obviously, some kind of ritual. There, perhaps, some kind of intoxicating substance. And further on, by the wavering light of the torch, he looks at the images of primitive animals. It seems to him that this powerful wall of the cave seems to part, and the spirits of the ancestors come out of there. Maybe in the form of these animals. Maybe in the form of some other spirits. Well, this is also an assumption, just a very beautiful one. And today it is shared by the majority. What will happen tomorrow, we do not know. We know these primitive paintings. We know strange burial places that are not entirely clear to us. We know some ancient patterns. We know the customs of various ancient tribes. How correctly we fold the figurine from these fragments. Here the lion man was first folded, he was 296 millimeters. And then he was folded in a different way. He was about the same, only he grew up and became 311 millimeters. Which one is correct? Maybe everything should be different? Well, that's the beauty of it. Let's hope that history, archaeology, ethnography, philosophy will tell us a lot more about primitive religion. Thanks to everyone who helped make this release possible. Thanks to our patron on Patreon. Thanks to our sponsors on YouTube. Those who want to conjure us a little bit of luck can also sign up for donations, or they can like this episode, or they can repost it so that as many people as possible know about it thanks to your magic. Thank you very much. And, of course, I would like to know, what do you think? Was there a non-religious period in the history of mankind? Did primitive people always believe in some kind of power, or were there hundreds, and maybe millions of years, when they lived without it? I look forward to your comments. Happily.